Genau. Shit. Yeah. Little Slim. Ja, Mann, die Röte. To use its pulley and winch for clearing the boulder to check the bluff in case he was still up there for whatever reason, Teasel must have radioed for it almost immediately. Digga. Ich glaube, ich mach die Lampe aus. Das war vorher besser, Digga. Das Schummerlicht. Aber ohne Bart sehe ich eh aus wie ein Fool. Rambo was 10 bloody lengths down the cliff when he heard it again, droning far off, gathering volume. He had taken what he judged was nearly a minute for every body length down this far. Each fissure and outcrop he grabbed onto hard to find. Each toe hold having to be tested, settling down, resting his weight on it little by little, breathing with relief when it stayed firm. Also der hängt jetzt an einem Abhang. Was ich in Filmen immer hasse, wenn die Leute nur an den Händen irgendwo hängen. Ich weiß nicht, das geht, glaube ich, nicht. Also es geht schon, aber wer kann das? Often he had dangled as he had at the top, shoes flailing against the rock face, scrabbling for support. His holds had been so far apart that climbing back up to avoid being seen by the helicopter would be as difficult as climbing down. Even then, he would probably not get up before the helicopter passed over him, so there was no point in trying. He might just as well keep climbing downwards, hoping the copter would not spot him. The rocks below distorted huge, attracting him as though he were leaning closer and closer into their image in a magnifying glass. And he tried to pretend this was merely like an exercise at jump school. It was not, though. And as he listened to the dogs, the helicopter droning near, he quickened his descent, hanging to the limit of his reach, taking less care to test his footholds, sweat dribbling itchy down his cheeks, accumulating tremulously on his lips and chin. Before, when he had heard the copter as he ran across the field of grass toward the cover of the fallen pine tree, the sound of its approach had been like a solid force that was pushing him. But here, now, restricted, slow in spite of his haste, he felt its growing roar as a slippery thing that was inching up from the small of his back. Heavier the higher it came. When the thing leached up to the base of his skull, he glanced over toward the sky behind him and clung motionless to the wall, the helicopter enlarging rapidly over the trees, bearing toward this cliff. His outside wool shirt was red against the gray of stone. He prayed the gunman would somehow fail to see it, but he knew that the gunman would have to see it. His fingers were dug bleeding into a slit in the cliff. The toes of his shoes were pressed hard onto an inch-wide ledge. His throat shuddered involuntarily as one shoe slipped off the ledge. The close whack of the bullet into the cliff by his right shoulder dazed him, and so startled that he almost lost his grip. Shaking his head to clear it, he began groping frantically down. Haben die auf ihn geschossen jetzt, oder was? The close whack of the bullet into the cliff by his right shoulder dazed him. Betäubt. Oder haben die ihn getroffen vorhin? And so startled that he almost lost his grip, shaking his head to clear it, he began groping frantically down. He managed only 3 more toe holds, and then there were no more. Kerrang! Ah yeah, the second bullet. Ricocheted off the rock, striking higher, nearer to his head. Da hat der Autor den Überraschungseffekt, Den Schuss hat er. Er hat den Schuss nicht gehört. Startling him as much as the first one, and he knew he was as good as dead. The jiggle over the copter was all that had saved him from being hit so far. It was drawn off the gunman's aim, and the pilot was springing on the copter fast, which made the jiggle worse, but it would not be long before the pilot understood and held the copter steady. His arms and legs trembling from the strain, he grasped down for a handhold, and then another, and then let down his feet, taking a chance, dangling again, scraping the cliff with his shoes for something, anything to step onto, like a cliffhanger. But it wasn't anything. He hung by his bleeding fingers, and the helicopter swooped toward him, like some grotesque dragonfly. And sweet Jesus, keep that damn thing moving. Don't let it hang still so he can get a decent shot. Chips of stone and molten bullet ripped burning into the side of his face. He peered at the rocks 100 feet below, sweat stinging his eyes. He barely made out a lush fir tree that rose up toward him, its top branches maybe 10 feet under him, or 15 or 20. He had no chance to figure. The helicopter looming huge, wind from the ruders rushing over him. He aimed his body at the top of the tree and let loose his puppy fingers and dropped. His stomach gushed up, his throat expanded in the sudden emptiness, and it was so long, so endless before he slammed past the first branches, plummeted through the clutching boughs, cracked to a stop against a stout limb. Absolutely numb. He could not breathe, he gasped and pain flooded his body. His chest throbbed sharply, and his back, and he was certain he had been shot. But he hadn't. And the din of the copter above the tree and the slash of a bullet through the branches got him moving. He was high in the tree. His rifle was still between his belt and his pants, but the impact when he hit had rammed it violently against the side, half paralyzed him. In agony, forcing his arm to bend, he clutched the gun and tugged, but it would not come. Above, the helicopter was circling, returning for another shot, and he was tugging at the gun, wrenching it free. The release so strong that the branch he was on started swaying. He slipped off balance, scraping his thigh along sharp bark, desperately hooking his arm around the branch above him. It made a crack. He quit breathing. If it broke, it would send him falling outward past the ends of the boughs down onto the rocks deep below. The branch made one more crack before it held firm, and he breathed again. But the sound from the copter was different now, constant, steady. The pilot was getting the idea, keeping it still. Rambo didn't know if they could see him in the tree or not, but that didn't matter much. The area at the top of the tree was so small that if the gunman sprayed it with bullets, he was sure to be hit. He didn't have time to switch to a stronger branch. The next bullet might finish him. He hurried, desperate. He pushed away needles and light bows and sought where the helicopter hung there, whipping in the air. Across from him, a house distance high, and craning his head out the open cockpit window was the gunman. Rambo saw his round, big-nosed face quite clearly as the man prepared to fire once more. A glance was all Rambo needed. In one smooth, instinctive motion, he raised his gun, barrel to the branch above him, steadied it there, and aimed out along it at the center of the round face, at the tip of the big nose. A gentle squeeze on the trigger. Bullseye. Inside the cockpit, the gunman clutched his sunken face. He was dead before he had a chance to open his mouth and scream. Damn. There was a moment when the pilot went on holding the helicopter steady like nothing had happened, and then at once Rambo saw through the glass front of the cockpit how it registered on the man that there were bits of bone and hair and brain everywhere. That the top of his partner's head was gone. Das heißt, der war so da gehangen und hat genau blasted his head off. Rambo saw him gape down in horror at the blood that was spattered across his shirt and pants. The man's eyes went wide. His mouth convulsed. The next thing he was fumbling with his seatbelt, clutching his throttle stick crazily as he dove to the cockpit floor. Rambo was trying to get a shot at him from the tree. He could not see the pilot, but he had a fair idea where the man would be huddled on the floor, and he was just aiming at that part of the floor when the helicopter veered sharply up the cliff. Its top section cleared the ridge nicely, but the angle of the copter was so steep that the rear section caught on the edge of the cliff. In the roar of the motor, he thought he heard a metallic crack when the rear section struck. He could not be certain. The copter seemed... Ist der ohnmächtig geworden, oder was? Ja, gaped down in horror. Er ist in Panik geraten oder so. The copter seemed interminably suspended there, and then with an abrupt flip over backward, it plunged down directly against the cliff wall. Screeching, cracking, blade bending and breaking as the explosion came.
Sag mal, was kannst du eigentlich?
A deafening ball of fire and sing of metal that flashed up past the tree and died. The outer branches of the tree burst in flame. A stench rose up of gasoline and burning flesh. Straight off, Rambo was on the move, scrambling down the tree. The branches were too thick. He had to circle the trunk to find where he could squeeze down. The dogs were barking louder, fiercer now, as if they were past the barricade up onto the ridge. That boulder should have taken longer to clear away. He couldn't understand how Diesel and the posse had climbed up so fast. He held tightly to his rifle, scraping down past the branches. Through the pointed needles pricking at his hands and face, his chest was throbbing from his drop into the tree. It hurt like some ribs were cracked or broken, but he couldn't let that bother him. The dogs were yelping closer. He had to climb down faster, twisting, sliding. His outside wool shirt caught on a branch and he ripped it loose faster. Those son of a bitch dogs. He had to go faster. Near the bottom, he reached thick black smoke that choked his lungs and saw indistinctly through it the twisted wreck of the helicopter burning and crackling. 20 feet from the bottom, he could not climb down any farther. There were no more branches. He couldn't spread his arms around the trunk and shinny down. It was too wide. Jump, no other way. The dogs yelping up on top. He checked the rocks and boulders underneath him and chose a spot where dirt and slit and dry brown needles were gathered in a pocket between the rocks, and without realizing, smiled. This sort of thing was what he had been trained to do. The weeks of leaping from towers at parachute school. Holding his rifle, he grabbed the last bow with his free hand and eased down, hanging, and dropped, and struck the ground perfectly. His knees buckled just right, and he slumped and rolled just right and came to his feet as properly as he had done 1,000 times before. It wasn't until he left the choking smoke around the shelter of the tree and scurried over the rocks that the pain in his chest got worse, much worse, and the smile disappeared. Christ, I'm going to lose. He charged over the rocks down a slope toward the forest, legs pounding, chest heaving painfully. It was grass ahead, and then he was out of the rocks and into the grass, racing toward the trees, and then he heard the dogs insanely loud on top behind him. They had to be where he tried climbing down the cliff. The posse would be shooting at him any time now. Out in the open like this, he didn't have a chance. He needed to get to the trees, dodging, ducking his head, using every trick he knew to make himself an awkward target, tensing himself to take the first bullet that would blow his back and chest apart as he burst through the bushes and scrubbed into the woods, pushing farther on, stumbling over vines and roots until he tripped and fell and stayed flat, gasping on the damp, sweet-smelling forest floor. They hadn't shot. He couldn't understand it. He lay there gasping, filling his lungs to capacity and exhaling and breathing deeply again, ignoring the pain in his chest each time he swelled it. Why hadn't they shot? And then he knew. Because they had never been on top of the cliff in the first place. They were still getting there. They had only sounded like they were on top. His stomach retched, but this time nothing came up. And he flopped onto his back, staring past the autumn-colored leaves toward the deep sky. What was the matter with him? He had never misjudged like that before. Mexico! The image of a warm wave-lapped beach flashed inside his mind. Get moving. I have to start moving. He struggled to his feet and was just trudging farther into the forest when he heard men shouting behind him. Dogs barking. And the possum was undoubtedly on top of the cliff now. He stopped and listened and still gasping for breath. He turned back to the way he came. Not the exact same path. The grass into the forest had been low. And he had left the track. That would be quite plain from the top of the cliff. The posse would be studying that part of the forest where he had entered. And as he came back, he might make some sign that would show them where he was. So he headed to the left, approaching a part of the forest's edge where they would not have no reason to expect him. When the trees began to thin out, he sank low and crawled to the edge, and crouching behind some brush, he saw something beautiful. 100 yards off, clear as could be on top of the cliff, were the men and the dogs. They were all running toward where he had climbed down. The dogs barking, one man behind the dogs hanging onto a master leash, the rest of the men rushing up behind, all stopping now and staring down at the smoke and fire of the helicopter. They were the closest Rambo had seen them since the hunt began. The sun stuck on them, making them seem very close, strangely magnified. 6 dogs, he counted. And then men. 9 in the grey police uniform of Diesel's men, and 1 in a green jacket and pants, that one holding the dog's master leash. The dogs were sniffing at where he had climbed over the edge, circling to check if the scent went anywhere else, returning to the edge and barking in frustration. The man in green was older than the rest and taller. He was soothing the dogs, patting them, talking to them gently in words that came across to him muffled. Some of the policemen were sitting, others standing to look down at the blazing helicopters, or else point toward the forest where he had entered. Damn. Ich finde das noch, die perfekte. Perfect lighting. Yeah. Yeah. There you go. But he wasn't interested in those, only in the one pacing back and forth, slapping his hand against his thigh. Wo wir wieder sehen können, jeder kann Mut zur Hässlichkeit haben. Und mit der richtigen Bescheinung kann man einiges rausholen. Teasel. There was no missing that short chunk of a body, that puffed out chest, the low head that darted side to side like a fighting rooster. Sure, like a cock. That's what you are, Teasel, a cock. The joke made him smile. It was shadowed where he lay under the bush, and resting was luxurious. He lined up, Teasel in his rifle sights. Just as Teasel spoke to the man in green, wouldn't Teasel be surprised to find that in the middle of a word, a bullet had gone in and out of his throat? What a joke that would be. He became so fascinated he almost pulled the trigger. It would have been a mistake. He wanted to kill him all right. After his scare being caught between the helicopter and the posse, he didn't care what he had to do to get away. And now that he thought about the 2 men he had killed in the helicopter, he realized he wasn't bothered as he had been after he had killed Gold. He was getting used to death again. But there was a question of priorities. The cliff would stop Teasel. It would just put him behind an hour or so. And killing Teasel wouldn't necessarily stop the posse. They would still have the hounds to keep them tracking fast. The hounds. They weren't vicious like the German shepherds he had seen in the war. But just the same, they were natural hunters. And if they ever caught him, they might even attack instead of merely cornering him, as hounds were schooled to do. So I had to shoot them first. After that, he would shoot Teasel, or the man in green, if he showed before Teasel. The way the man handled the dogs, Rambo was sure he knew a lot about tracking. And with both him and Teasel dead, the others likely wouldn't know what to do. They'd have to drift back home. For sure, they didn't seem to know much about this kind of fighting. He was standing or sitting in plain view up there, and he sniffed in disgust. Evidently, they had not even considered that he might still be around. Hä? Who? The man in green was having trouble getting the dogs quiet. They were bunched together, tangled in each other's way. For sure, they didn't seem to know much about this kind of fighting. They were standing or sitting in plain view up there, and he sniffed in disgust. Evidently, they had not even considered that he might still be. Ach so, he ist Rambo. Die denken, der wurde vom Helikopter erschlagen oder er ist abgehauen. Jedenfalls wissen sie nicht, dass er sie sieht. The man separated the masked police and handed over 3 dogs to a deputy. Rambo lay beneath the cool underbrush and aimed at the 3 that the man in green had kept and shot 2 of them just like that. He would have hit the 3rd dog with his neck shut if the man in green had not yanked it back from the edge. The policemen were shouting, jumping low out of sight. The other set of dogs was acting wild, howling, straining to get away from the deputy who held them. Rambo quickly shot one. Another shied off the cliff, and the deputy holding the leash tried to pull it back instead of letting go. Lost balance and dragging the last of his dogs with him. He went over the side too. He wailed once just before the thump on the rocks far below. Damn. Ziemlich nüchtern.